As I said in my prayer this evening, I find it strange that we should have this message about a sexual assault on a young woman in the week that we've just had, going on throughout our land and all the trouble that it's caused. So maybe there's a special word here. We're looking at the life of David. We've reached 2 Samuel chapter 13, where last time we saw what happened to the child that was born to David and Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan had said that it would die, but David lay on the ground for 7 whole days and prayed for this tiny boy, hoping that God might change his mind. But in the end, the boy died, and David went to God's house and he worshipped the Lord. He comforted Bathsheba, and later on she gave birth to another son who was Solomon, and he would eventually become the next king. But Nathan had prophesied that the evil that David had done against Uriah would come back on him in his own family, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And the 13th chapter of 2 Samuel, which we're beginning looking at this evening, brings out that great New Testament truth very clearly. Not only do we see David's troubles coming to him through his own family, as it had been prophesied, but it came exactly the same way as the sins that he'd sown. So that just like he'd been immoral with another man's wife, so somebody would be immoral with his daughter. And just like he'd murdered Uriah, so somebody would murder his son. David loved his children, and he must have wondered which of them would be the cause of future punishment. The fact that David didn't later punish his sons, either for rape or murder, suggests that he was too easygoing with them. Rather like Eli had been with his 2 wicked sons, and which led to the death of many of their descendants. It's a strange thing that you can get parents who are very fine Christians and who seek to live a godly life, and yet when it comes to their children, they allow them to do things which are not only wrong, but which are harmful. With most people, they can easily see the failings in other people's children, but not the failings in their own children. But it needs to be noticed in the life of David that none of his children went astray until he himself had gone astray. For up until then, they looked to their father as a pillar of godliness, from whom they had received much spiritual teaching from God's law. And they'd no doubt read his Psalms, and he'd been a great example to them. But from this point onwards, David's children took little notice of what they'd been taught, and the latter part of David's life was filled with trouble for him because of it. So the opening verse of chapter 13 introduces us to 3 of his children, Absalom and his sister Tamar. Their mother was a woman called Maacah. And then Amnon, the eldest son, the crown prince, his mother was Ahinoam. And we're told that Tamar was fair, meaning to say that she was good looking. And Amnon, her half-brother, fancied her a great deal. It says in verse 1 that he loved her. But as later on in verse 15 it says that he hated her exceedingly after the dreadful deed had been done, we have to assume that the love that he had was nothing more than a great attraction. He couldn't stop himself looking at her. Whenever she walked into a room, things seemed to light up for him, and it developed into a passion, and then he began to lust after her. Indeed, verse 2 states that he was so vexed that he became ill about it. He lost his appetite for food, and nothing else in life seemed to matter anymore. He knew that she was denied to him because she was his half-sister. Although they had different mothers, they had the same father. So how could they marry each other? There were, of course, plenty of other girls, especially as he was the crown prince. They'd all be queuing up at his door, but he didn't want them. He wanted the only girl that he couldn't have. Ever since Satan tempted Eve to want the only thing that was forbidden to her, he's given people a desire for that which is forbidden. Other things they can have quite legitimately, but no, they want the thing that God has forbidden. As Proverbs says, stolen waters are sweet. As for Tamar, she seems to have been oblivious to Amnon's desire after her. She probably put his obvious interest in her down to the love of an older brother. But just like Bathsheba's beauty was to cause her much trouble, so it would be for Tamar. If a woman is beautiful, it would not be wrong of her to be thankful for that, but it would be wrong of her to be proud of that. For first of all, it was God who gave her the beauty. She didn't get it herself. And secondly, if she's not very careful, her beauty could be her undoing, and she could finish up in a much sadder state than the plain ladies around her. As for Amnon, we can't just blame his father's sin and his behaviour. He must have hardened his heart against God before this, for surely David would have taught his first son about the Lord more than anybody else. But as the Puritans used to say, although corruption runs in the blood, godliness does not. Just like some people have to suffer bad health or a bad job or a bad home, so other people have to suffer bad children. Perhaps Amnon toyed with the idea that as his father had been immoral with a woman, then maybe it would be all right for him to do so. Whatever children see their parents doing, they will deem it all right for them to do. If they see their parents smoking and drinking and swearing and gambling and getting themselves into debt or whatever it is, even if those parents believe in God and teach their children so, those sons and daughters will believe that they can also do those things even if they believe in God. But of course, what Amnon thought of doing was worse than his father's wickedness. Whereas Bathsheba was willing, Tamar would not be. Now, verse 3, Amnon had a friend, a man by the name of Jonadab, and he was also his relative. And Jonadab was a very evil man. It says that he was very subtle, which is the same word that's used to describe Satan. It means being clever in a deceitful way, like a man who does card tricks using the sleight of hand. You think he's going to do one thing, but really he's going to do something else. And Satan has been fooling people like this for centuries, subtly suggesting that the sinful way of life leads to enjoyment, not disaster. Well, Jonadab was like that. He knew how to trick people. He knew how he could trick a girl into being immoral. And sad to say, there are men like that today. They meet a girl and they're all friendly towards her, but they're only interested in getting that girl to be immoral with them. Jonadab came to Amnon and asked him why he was sick and so depressed. Come on now, he says, pull yourself together. Things can't be all that bad. After all, you're the king's son. You can have whatever you like. Tell me what your problem is. Well, this reminds me a bit about King Ahab when he couldn't get Naboth's vineyard. And he too became very depressed. And his wife Jezebel said much the same thing to him. Dost thou now not govern Israel? You govern the land, you're the king. Of course you can have Naboth's vineyard. I will get it for you. Let nobody be so foolish as to think that members of the royal family don't have their troubles like other people. They certainly do, more if anything. Now Amnon confessed to Jonadab why he was downcast. He says, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. Now if Jonadab had been a good friend and a true friend to Amnon, he would advise him to have nothing to do with this girl. The whole business was fraught with danger. It couldn't possibly end up with any lasting satisfaction. If he touched this girl, he would not only have his father against him, but her brother Absalom, who was known to be a violent man, he'd be against him as well. That's what Jonadab should have told him, but he thinks only of pleasing Ammon in the short term, and thereby showed himself to be more of an enemy than a friend. People are in a bad way when their only friends they have actually encourage them to do evil. And they haven't got somebody who will tell them the truth and say to them, don't even think about it. How often we've urged young Christians to make friends of God's children For if they've got ungodly friends, they will be influenced to do ungodly deeds and lose out thereby. I would say to every young person who calls himself a Christian, if you really mean business with God, then you've got to break off a friendship with anybody who encourages you to do that which is wrong. And find yourself good Christian friends who will be a help to your soul, even if you feel they're not so much fun to be with as the other people. Now, Jonadab suggested to Ammon that he gets Tamar into his bedroom, and then he can overpower her and rape her. Rape is just about the worst of all crimes, for no sort of retribution can be made afterwards. If a man steals some money and then later feels bad about that, he can give the money back. But if a man rapes a woman and then later on feels bad about that, he can't make that up to her. He can never put that right. But Amnon's crime would not only be rape, but also incest, for he would be going with his sister. And yet his passion overcame any common sense that he had, and he decided to take Jonadab's advice. Jonadab had told him to act as though he was ill. Then when his father, the king, came to see him, he should ask him if he would send Tamar to him to prepare a meal for him to eat. And this is the way he'd get her into his bedroom. And Amnon acts on that bad advice and asks David to send Tamar to him so that she could make him a couple of cakes. Now, in the process of sowing and reaping that God has inbuilt into human life, it was necessary that the reaping back of what David had done would have David's own hand in it without him knowing it. For David had used somebody else to kill Uriah, and now Amnon would actually use David to help him bring about this great crime. And it'd be the same later on, if you know how the story goes on, when Absalom murdered Amnon. For Absalom would also ask David to send Amnon to him, and David did so. No doubt when David looked back on these crimes and all the sorrow that he got from them, it would impress upon him the connection between his own sin and what had happened. And remember that David had actually used Uriah himself to take the letter to Joab containing his own death warrant. Poor Uriah's own hand was in what had happened to him. So it must be with David. And these unpleasant things are written for our learning, that we may be careful not to do wrong ourselves. Now, Ammon is careful to make sure that Tamar doesn't make the cakes before she came into the bedroom. She must make them when she gets there. That would keep her in the bedroom a lot longer. And David is completely taken in by this. He suspects nothing. And he tells Tamar that she must go to Ammon's house and be beside his bedside and make him a couple of cakes. No doubt later on David must have kicked himself for having been so foolish and having been taken in like that. Tamar herself suspected nothing. But then why should she from a sick brother? And verse 8 tells us that she went to Ammon with the flour and kneaded it and made cakes. So here's an interesting point as a sideline. Tamar was a princess and very beautiful, and we're told later on that she was dressed in the finest clothes of different colours. But that doesn't make her think that food preparation was beneath her. She was obviously used to making cakes. Proverbs says that a virtuous woman worketh willingly with her hands. And it's well that every young woman has got some idea about cooking, no matter what she might be planning to do with her life. And I hope I don't get blamed for being sexist by saying that. Now, whilst Tamar was baking the cakes, there were several attendants in the room who Ammon must get rid of before he can do his terrible deed. When he gets the cakes given to him, he won't eat them. He pretends that his appetite had gone because of so many people around him. They must all leave the room. And this is what they do. And they leave Tamar on her own with Amnon. Amnon then asks Tamar to come with him into an inner chamber. But as soon as she does so, he ended the pretense and revealed to her his true reason for getting her there. Come lie with me, my sister, he says in verse 11. Even the words were sickening, calling her his sister, and it would seem from this that he first tried to get Tamar to be immoral with him voluntarily. He invited her to do it, as if such a pure girl would ever consent to such a thing. It was the last thing in the world that she would want to do, for apart from it being sinful and dirty in the sight of God, she was a virgin, and we're told that twice. And she no doubt looked forward to a happy marriage one day and going with a man that she really loved. Even the suggestion that she'd go with her half-brother would have made her feel dirty. But we can see from this the horrible truth that men like to believe, and that is that certain women are as sexually rotten as they are, and that their lust for a woman does not cause that woman distress. We've heard a bit about it this week in the news, haven't we? But how often must we hear those lies when a woman has been raped? She asked for it. It was her own fault. She deliberately egged him on. She wore provocative clothes. She was out late at night. She seemed to hang around men all the time. If these are reasons to shame a woman for life, that's terrible. Needless to say, in verse 12, Tamar cried out against Amnon's suggestion and pleaded with him not to force her, but to see common sense. She's terrified and greatly surprised at this turn of events, and she tries to reason with Amnon that they are brother and sister, and therefore this is madness and terribly wrong. The word there she uses is folly. It's folly. It can only lead you to trouble. Just think what's going to happen to you after this. How you're going to face our father. What will the people of Israel think about you, their crown prince? Indeed, to your dying day, people will look down on you. And who's going to marry you? Who will marry a known rapist? And what of my brother Absalom? What will he do about it? The whole thing is folly. It's a loser from beginning to end. And Tamar also mentions the fact that such a thing as rape ought not to be done in Israel of all places. It's such a terrible thing, it should never be heard of even amongst the people of God. In heathen lands, where the people know nothing of God, well, perhaps such things like this happen, but surely not in Israel. It's rather like saying filthy thoughts and filthy suggestions. You might be expected them at a nightclub, but never in a church. And these words suggest that Tamar could have been a godly girl as well as a pure girl. The innocent Uriah had shown concern of the ark of God, and now the innocent Tamar shows concern for the people of God. But probably her most important word of all was the word nay, meaning no. He had said to her, "Come lie with me," and she answered him, "No." And that's always the key word for the woman. Even today in the court of law, it's usually seen as the big difference between fornication and rape. For the word no shows that the woman does not give her consent. And Tamar backs this up with the word force. "Nay, my brother, do not force me." It shows that she didn't give her consent. She certainly would not do it voluntarily. He'd have to force her. Bathsheba had said yes, but Tamar said no. She further says in verse 13, "And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go?" She appeals to Amnon to think about her situation, for even if nobody else was ever to know about what had happened, Tamar herself would never forget it, and her shame would be ever before her. And if it was found out, which was probably was going to happen, she could never look anybody in the face anymore. As for Amnon, he would become one of the fools of Israel. People would always look down on him in the future and think, what an idiot he'd been. How much he'd given up for this one act. They would see him as being unfit to rule the nation, and he could possibly lose his place on the throne because of it. It shows again that many a bright future that certain young men might be looking forward to can be thrown away by their own immorality. And then Tamar, in one last desperate attempt to get herself free and escape the inevitable assault, suggests that Amnon could go to the king and ask for a hand in marriage, for surely David could set aside the law and allow them to marry. Tamar no doubt had no intention of marrying Ammon, even if the thing had been legal and right in the sight of God. He was obviously a horrible person through and through, but without actually saying it, she pretends that she would be prepared to marry him so as to make him give up the idea of rape. And if Ammon had taken this option, no doubt Tamar would have told David of what had happened and what Ammon had tried to do to her, and the king would have protected her. Now the sad thing is that nothing that Tamar had said prevailed, as verse 14 says. Howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her and lay with her. Remember that she'd only gone there to help him. She'd gone there to do him some good. But he repays her with such terrible wickedness. He'd said that he loved Tamar, but this was an act of great hatred. This was such a terrible crime that it's very difficult for us to believe that he'd lived a good life up till now and he'd not done anything like this before, and what this was out of his character. No, he must have been a bad fellow all the time. The probability is that he'd been immoral with other young women before this and had become worse and worse. We then read these amazing words in verse 15. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he loved her. The reason why he hated her so much now was because she knew how wicked he was. She'd found out how wicked he was. And such is the way of life that it's often the case that where a young man has been over the moon about a certain girl, so long as she resists his sexual advances, as soon as she gives in to him, he goes off her. And that's happened to thousands of girls, because young men lose their respect for them if they've allowed them to abuse her. Some girls have actually given in to a boy in order to keep his love, and in doing so they've lost his love. People never seem to learn that sex before marriage is not an act of love, it's an act of hatred. And when any young man says to a girl, if you really love me, you'd let me do this, she should reply to him, if you really love me, you wouldn't ask me to do this. It is a fact of life which very few people in our own generation can understand, that the greater respect a boy has got for a girl and the more he truly loves her, the less chance there is that he will seek to defile her. And you can see this here. For now Amnon can't wait to get rid of Tamar and tells her to get out. So whereas he should have begged her forgiveness, he was now treating her as if she was the one in the wrong and that she was guilty of egging him on. Nothing could have been further from the truth. That's sometimes the way people twist the situation, even in their own minds. See how quickly then that lust can turn into loathing, and that the thing that somebody longs after, the thing they think they can't have too much of, when they get it, they may well lose it and toss it on one side. In verse 16, Tamar appeals to Ammon not to treat her so badly. There was no cause to treat her like that, for this was following one great wrong after another great wrong. See, Ammon's plan now was to admit that he'd been immoral with Tamar, but say that it was her fault. And that's why he got the servant to throw her out, as if she had been the one in the wrong. He was going to tell the great lie that she had seduced him to be immoral, which is why Tamar says that this was even worse than the actual rape. Maybe it was going to make out that it was the same position as Joseph had been in with Potiphar's wife. You remember that? As if Tamar had thrown herself at him and seduced him into having sex with her, And he was so affronted by this that he calls to the servant to throw her out, so as to imply to the servant that he'd been treated wrongly by Tamar. Sadly, these are the sort of things that are said and done in many rape cases, where at his trial the rapist tries to make out that it was the girl who egged him on and that he was innocent. So poor Tamar is now in a desperate situation. Not only has she been raped, but it would appear that she was going to get blamed for it. How on earth could she face her father or anybody else? What would people believe about her now? And so in this terribly stressed condition, she returns to her own apartment, but on the way, she puts some ashes on her head and starts to tear her lovely coloured clothes. She puts her hand upon her head and was crying uncontrollably. And it all shows how bitterly she resented what had happened, how terribly she felt within. And the tearing of her gorgeous clothes may also suggest that at that moment she resented the fact that she'd been good looking, which had partly led to all this trouble. In verse 20, her full brother Absalom came out to meet her and seems to have guessed what had happened. For he asks, "Has Ammon, not your brother, been with you?" Perhaps Absalom knew what sort of a person Ammon was, and he put two and two together. But Absalom is clever enough not to rush over to Amnon's place and have a fight with him. He felt that the crime was too great for a mere punch-up in the heat of the moment. No, he would bide his time, and then he would murder Amnon without mercy. There's an old saying, you probably know it: revenge is a dish that is best served cold. In other words, if you're going to get your own back on somebody, best to give it time, and you've cooled down, and the person's not expecting it. And so Absalom tells Tamar to hold her peace, as if to say, don't spread it about what's happened, don't take it too much to heart. He's even playing the thing down to Tamar herself so that she won't have any idea of what he's planning to do to Ammon. He didn't want Tamar telling her father, David, what he was planning to do regarding revenge. And indeed, Absalom was to bide his time for 2 full years before he finally killed the rapist. And this shows that rapists may think they got away with their crime, but it will eventually come back up on them, and great will be their punishment. And so we're told at the end of verse 20 that Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. In other words, she lived on in solitude and sorrow, and sadly, the fact that it states that she remained desolate rather suggests that she probably never married. Jewish history tells us that because of this awful event, a law was passed which forbade a young man and a young lady ever to be left alone with each other. That's obviously taking things too far. Young people, though, should see the great danger involved in the boy and girl relationship, and Christian girls should be very careful not to get involved with a non-Christian boy. We live in a dangerous world. It's not just physically dangerous, it's morally dangerous. And the only way to keep ourselves pure and clean is to live for Christ and stay in God's will and pray for his protection. May we all take this sad business to heart and be careful in the future as to what we do and who we mix with, and to God be the glory. Amen.